I'll be talking today about a non-local form of psychic experience, but local enough to be confined within our brains, namely the way we communicate with ourselves and the way that's related to our brain process. I think that the fundamental issue that Descartes left to us was how, in modern terms, how complex systems which are open to external energy, mass, and so forth, could register conscious experience, and how conscious experience could be informed by those complex systems. So what I'd like to explore toward a science of conscious systems is, first of all, what the domain of study ought to be. Every science, I'm a philosopher of science, needs an empirical domain. So what are the systems that might be conscious? And I would say that there are candidates at just about every scale. We're conscious, of course. Our mammalian friends are. I'm sure the insects that Tom, is it, Dijkstra spoke of are conscious. But are cells conscious? Are atoms conscious? I think a good regulative principle would be to consider the whole spectrum. Third, we have to ask how complex systems could interrelate with conscious experience. And that conscious experience may be conceived as a separate substance, as Descartes did. It could be conceived of as an aspect of complex systems, or consciousness and complexity may be seen as two different expressions of the same thing. But however we conceive the ontology, the question is, how does our consciousness influence our brain and vice versa? And that's a very real question from an evolutionary point of view, because obviously consciousness, or greater and greater degrees of it, has proven to have an evolutionary function, or our brains would not have evolved the way they have. Finally, I want to explore just what kinds of scientific programs could actually study such issues. To begin with, let's consider the possible candidates for conscious systems. Is consciousness limited to mammals or vertebrates? If so, is their consciousness associated with all the information processing inherent in their bodies, or associated more directly with their nervous systems, brains, the computational sophistication of their brains, certain brain structures, or certain patterns of brain activity, such as coherently firing neurons? Do plants and fungi have their own forms of consciousness? Are single cells, such as unicellular eukaryotes, bacteria, colonial cells, or cells within multicellular organisms, conscious? What about the fundamental particles, atoms and ions, molecules and macromolecules, electrical and magnetic fields, electromagnetic radiation, electric currents, and other constituents of conscious systems? Are they conscious? And what I'm trying to do is to stretch our imaginations as to the possible conscious systems, to then try to limit the domain of conscious systems to talk about what such a science would be like. Do the superpositions of the states of certain bodily components that are described by wave functions, such as the alternative states of allosteric proteins and microtubules, constitute conscious systems? Is the universe or multiverse considered as a system, conscious in its own right, over and above the consciousness of any of its subsystems? You'll recognize that as the question of God's existence. Are there any systems or phenomena which don't have spatially manifest bodies which are conscious? Do lovers, families, businesses, interest groups, communities, societies, or civilization enjoy a form of shared consciousness? Bob John once suggested that I think it was in remote viewing experiments that or telepathic experiments, I forget, whether the remote participants were part of a single conscious system. And that's always the question when certain phenomena seem to transcend our own individuality. Are ecosystems or the biosphere conscious? Can sophisticated robots be conscious? So, of all these possibilities, what specific kinds of experience or organization should we consider as essential to conscious systems? Well, obviously, they have experience, and what I would also suggest is that they have memory. Because if we're conscious in isolation from memory, then we will not be applying our past experience in any way, and we won't be conscious in a context that might qualify as pure consciousness without an object and without an identity. But how would that consciousness even know it exists if it didn't have a memory to consider the question in the context of? So I'll make that assumption for the time being. And that, by the way, implies certain kinds of physicality or materiality, even in other dimensions, but certain kinds of materiality are associated with conscious systems, and that's why I'm using the term systems in the first place. Now, what kinds of systems would they be? Well, they would, the conscious systems would interact with the mass and energy of their environment, because clearly they're open systems. If they do quantum measurement, if they register the collapse of wave functions, or however we conceive it, that requires energy. And if they have to be more or less organized to store that information and to organize their conscious responses, their behavior, then they have to be far from equilibrium. They have to sustain steady states. They have to be sensitive to perturbations. And more generally, such systems are interactive with and informed by internal and external systems and phenomena at many scales and degrees of organization, including other conscious systems which are always in our environment, and vacuum fluctuations which, since Bernie Heisch's work with Hal Puthoff and so forth, we should never forget. Every atom is bathed in the vacuum, so are our brains, and so are cells. And we have to ask what significance that has. Conscious systems, just like any others, don't exist, if you'll forgive the pun, in a vacuum. So what do conscious systems do? most importantly, they evaluate options, construct patterns, and initiate causal series in potentially creative and effective responses to considered aspects of their environment and history. That's something of a formal definition. In terms of cognitive science concerns, they reveal imaginative, emotive, cognitive, and executive functions, or something like that. So my approach at my Institute for the Study of Conscious Systems is along the lines of the acronym ISOCOSM. That is, I think we should treat every different scale from the microcosm to the macrocosm equally. So the isocosm then is the full spectrum of levels of organization in the universe, ranging from the smallest spatial or temporal scales, the microcosm, to the largest, viewed without prejudice as to their possible or potential ability to harness or synergize with the capacity of the universe around them in conscious experience and behavior. So, what then is the relationship between consciousness and electromagnetic complexity in such conscious systems? Let's consider the case of human beings with the understanding that atoms and cells and the universe as a whole, or God, might also be conscious. Even the Nobel laureate Francis Crick, an arch materialist if there ever were one, spoke of the neural correlates of consciousness. And he was interested in 40 hertz waves and so forth. He changed his views later on. But another Nobel laureate, Gerald Edelman, emphasized the thalamocortical oscillations in the 40 hertz range, not only because there's more or less coherent firing during nonspecific and specific conscious experience, but also because there's such a richness of complexity in the thalamocortical oscillations. There's the correlation, but there's also the independence of firing, and he thought that that would provide the opportunity for maximal information processing. But there are also non-neural correlates of consciousness, Stuart Hameroff's microtubules, which are rather large quantum phenomena. Jim Oshman's living matrix, which includes the field and quantum mechanical connections of the whole body. Beverly Rubik's biofield, she's sitting here. Yet, what are these structures related to? They might register quantum effects, and that's the fundamental possibility I want to explore. The other side of physical reality, the quantum vacuum or plenum, zero-point energy. And I would suggest that what we need is a quantum gateway between source and manifestation, between the conscious world and the world of complexity. And I'm not making an ontological point there. It's a causal point. So how might that work? If the electromagnetic oscillations in our brain are anything like the oscillations in an atom, they have an organizing effect on vacuum fluctuations. So our brain, in exploring alternative possibilities in its oscillations, even before they come to consciousness, would have this organizing effect just the way atoms do. In the same way that the energy levels of electrons around the atomic nucleus are such as they are because of the relationship between the vacuum and and the real particles in the vacuum, and this relationship is described by wave functions. In the same way, the oscillations in our brains might also be described by wave functions, the alternative options that we're considering. Those wave functions, if explored consciously, so to speak, with the distributed attention involved in sustaining all the possibilities, might lead to conscious choice in one direction or another. And so the collapse or decoherence of the wave function might have entangled, give me 2 more minutes, might allow for the possibility of an iterative preference registered in the oscillations of the brain, which are amplified to change the state of the brain. So what are the broader implications? I think this perspective illustrates just one possible theory that shows that a science of conscious systems might be feasible. We need collaborative programs involving many disciplines to make this possible. The implication, if something like this turns out to be true, is that there might actually be a coevolution of consciousness and complexity, so that we get better and better vehicles of consciousness as our consciousness succeeds better and better. And ultimately, we might develop a theory of everything that includes consciousness as well as physical phenomena. And to use Stuart Kaufman's term, this would put us at home in the universe and provide us with a more integrated worldview. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, I agree completely with your objective. Do you visualize that it would result in equations that would predict things?
Oh, absolutely. Among the disciplines I list here would be quantum theorists and I mean to include biophysicists, neuroscientists, and necessarily. That's not to say this solves the hard problem of consciousness and would reveal its nature.
Francesca McCartney.
Yes.
Under your conscious system's minimal attributes, the World Wide Web has 5 out of the 6 minimal attributes. Would you consider the World Wide Web as a conscious system?
Well, I'd consider it as, you might call it, the neural correlates of biospherical consciousness. That is to say, just as the nervous system emerged in multicellular organisms that were getting too complex to be efficient, so the internet has emerged in a society that's too complex to be efficient, and the same mystery of consciousness may be associated with it, if not now, then eventually.
John, this is not so much a question of this speaker, more of a comment and more pertaining to virtually everything we've been hearing the last few days. We are, as best I can summarize it, attempting to make models of how consciousness perceives and, for our business, potentially influences physical reality. My rhetorical question is, given the amount of and disparity of effort we have put into that issue, would it not be at least self-consistent to contemplate how consciousness constructs models of anything, including of what I just said? In fact, wouldn't we quickly follow on through now, not to a study of how consciousness affects reality, but how consciousness models consciousness effects on reality? And why stop there? We can then go on to talk about how consciousness constructs models of consciousness, constructing models of consciousness influencing reality. Because you see, all of the concepts, all of the vocabulary that has appeared in this business are inventions of our consciousness. We are modeling the inventions of consciousness in an attempt to model from the get-go. Where does this all take you? Simply that you're digging yourself a progressively deeper epistemological hole here that is not likely to come out on the other end with anything terribly useful unless we show a little humility about our role on both sides of this issue.
I'm sure that's true.
That has to be our last question, although the speaker may have something to say in reply. I'm not sure.
Well, I think that we all have different perspectives, and yet we may be like the blind men around the elephant, each seeing the part of the elephant he's in contact with. And if we have that sense that we're all after an understanding of the same reality, however it's integrated, we know that it's integrated, or we wouldn't be here, then we're working together at it rather than competing in our views. And I think that attitude could lead to the kind of collaboration and worldview that we need to really save the planet.